This is part of an initiative of 4 universities. USC is hosting this particular meeting. George Washington University, represented by our moderators, and also Howard University and the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. We are extending this network, and we will have additional universities that are interested. We have additional universities that are interested in Africa and in the US. And so we have no idea how big this network is going to be in another year. We'll find out. We are meeting, of course, at a time when there's a lot of this topic in the news. We have the Africa-Russia summit, which did not, I think, turn out the way Russia wanted, and nor did it turn out the way many African countries wanted. There's much hesitation than in the past. There are many events going on the continent that are right at the heart of our topic today. You have speaker bio. We had Professor Nzonga had to drop out because of family emergency, and family first. So we hope to have again in a future program. We also, I think, if you look at the, you can understand why this happened. Our friend from the National Security Council dropped out at the last minute of meetings over there. But we have a full program. As you can see, we have a number of people joining us from Africa. And this is an Africa-US initiative. We always want to have speakers from Africa in the discussion. So it's not people on this side of the Atlantic talking about Africa. It's a genuine conversation. Our next program is on the back of your speaker bio. It's going to be on Monday, August 28th, 9 a.m. right here. The subject will be climate change. And we'll have some remarks from someone who's written about climate change and electric power and much more. So, Ambassador, we'll look forward to seeing you again next month. Thank you. Also, introduce 2 people. I know many of you know them already, but Felicia Pratt in the back in the orange, wearing Syracuse colors today. She is actually, she's been a longtime manager of USC in Washington, and she used to manage a suite at 701 Pennsylvania Avenue, and now she manages this entire building. So anything you need to know, or that she undoubtedly knows it, and may have actually built it or programmed it. And Judy Kang was coordinator of these programs, who has a role in this program and other programs that we do here, including public diplomacy, national security, democratic resilience, and more. We also, on the back of your speaker bios, is a biography of our moderator, Jennifer Cooke, from George Washington University, who has as extensive a background in Africa as anybody, I think, in this town. So we without pointing at each other. So now let us get the conversation underway with Professor Cooke. Jennifer.
Great. I will keep it short because we do have the bios here with us. Welcome, everyone. Really, I'm so delighted to be part of this series that has really brought such great speakers, both here in Washington and particularly those based in Africa, from West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, Central Africa. It's been a real privilege. We're talking today about kind of perspectives on kind of the global governance systems and African perspectives on transforming and, let's say, perhaps equalizing or democratizing systems of global governance. So perspectives on multilateralism, on some of the global governance institutions, and ways, and I don't think there's one perspective on how those might be kind of reformed to reflect a very different world than when many of them were founded 50, 60 years ago. This series was launched the day after the Africa Leaders Summit here in Washington, DC. And so kind of amidst the Biden administration rolling out its strategy towards Africa. And I think one of the important elements of that strategy was how to more effectively align US policy with aspirations expressed by Africans themselves, and particularly in the global governance realm. And so early on, the rhetoric was we plan to work more closely with African governments on some of the global challenges that affect the globe. Now, how that rolls out in practice, we will see. But very much at the beginning of the administration, a turn towards to reinforce the importance of multilateralism. President Biden in his first weeks gave a talk, spoke to the African Union. They're trying to include the African Union in the G20. So again, trying to perhaps equalize some of the global structures that have not benefited Africa as well as they might. At the same time, you have moves by other powers within the world to kind of create new alliances, the BRIC alliance in particular. And we're at a moment, and we discussed this in our discussion on African strategies towards great powers, of big tectonic shifts in the global order of things. And new alliances forming, new centers of power. And as Bob Dylan said, the wheel is still in spin on this. We don't know where this is all going to end up. And so the question is, where would Africa, and I use that very loosely because as one of the themes that has come across again and again in these meetings has been the diversity of perspectives from Africa. So if we're talking about reform of the Security Council, for example, how would Africa be represented on the Security Council? Who would represent Africa on the Security Council? I don't think there's any kind of consensus within Africa on what reform of the global system should look like. So we're trying to get some of those perspectives here today. And I think we have two fantastic speakers, but we have also, as was said, we have a wealth of expertise and experience in the room. So we're looking forward to a very interactive discussion on this. I will start with Arhin Acheampong, Deputy Director of the Afro-Sino Center of International Relations in Accra, to maybe start us off with kind of some thoughts on where he sees or what he hears as kind of the priority asks from African governments and African regional bodies in terms of this idea of reform and kind of what a new multilateralism might look like. And then I will turn to Priyal Singh, who's a senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies, Peace Operations and Peacebuilding Program in Pretoria, South Africa. Just to get us started with some of your initial thoughts, and then we can kind of expand on those and turn to the audience for discussion. So, Mr. Acheampong, we'll begin with you. I hope you can hear me. And okay, great. So I'll turn the floor over to you. Maybe we can reverse the order.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so sorry to put you on the spot. Singh, why don't we begin with you and then we'll come back to Mr. Acheampong.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to address you all this morning. If I can just ask the facilitator, can you just repeat one more time the question? You broke up, unfortunately, for a minute before you began speaking.
Oh, well, first to get maybe a first impression, a first take on kind of where you see the critical needs for reform in the global system, global governance systems, or what you see or what you're hearing are the priorities for reform of the global system. What's the challenge? What's the complaint? Or what's the opportunity, let's say?
All right. Well, thank you very much. So I think to begin, I'll argue that I believe we are, in fact, at an inflection point in the international system as we speak. A lot of the need for reform of the international multilateral system has been building for a number of years. And I think all of this really came to a head with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February last year. And I think from an African perspective, if we had to look at the voting patterns within the UN General Assembly's 11th emergency special sitting on Ukraine, we do see that African states, or Africa as a bloc, is in fact the most divided region globally in outrightly condemning Russian aggression. And I think, trying to find an easy answer to this does an injustice to some of the broader dynamics at play, because I think this speaks to some of the long-standing issues that African states have often felt with the current international system as it's currently composed or currently organized. And I think this is also based on the fact that where we are in the world right now is we see an African continent in which most African states are naturally poised as revisionist actors in the international system, specifically because the current international order and the current multilateral system has not led to the kinds of political and economic dividends that African states would have expected over the last 50 or so years, last 60, 70 years since their independence. So the current international order has not led to the necessary gains that African states need for them to close the gap with the rest of the world. Our institute does long-term futures forecasting on political and economic developments in Africa. And we do see that, over the next coming decades, there is going to be growth, economic growth and developments in Africa. But this growth and developments is not going to keep pace with the rest of the world. And in fact, what we are witnessing currently is an increasing gap between Africa and the rest of the world when it comes to some of the basic economic indicators that we look at to get a sense of progress and economic development, growth, and so on. So African states, they look at the international order as something that is inherently unjust. It is structured on a composition of power that is rooted in historical injustices. It's rooted in a system of power that really took shape after the Second World War and does not reflect the realities of today. And as a result, many African states are deeply suspicious of vital global international institutions like the International Criminal Courts, the International Court of Justice, the UN system in general, especially the UN Security Council, the UN Human Rights Council, and so on. So I think this growing suspicion, if these issues are not addressed, we're going towards a credibility and legitimacy crisis. And that is going to push African states into a far closer political orbit with other revisionist powers in the international system, away from the West and towards a closer political orbit with other emerging powers. Because for many African states, any alternative to the current international order represents a good alternative. Countries like South Africa are definitely at the forefront of this agenda. But I believe that countries like South Africa and a number of other African countries have not necessarily substantiated what they would want an alternative international order to look like, what it could look like, what it should look like. We are simply pursuing an alternative international order based on a more multipolar dispensation of power for the sake of it, because the current system is just not working in our favor. I think I'll conclude here for my opening remarks. Thank you.
Excellent, because I think that opens up the big question of what should it look like? What might it look like? What are the options? And so excellent start to that. Let's turn to Mr. Acheampong, if we've gotten that.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Singh, for that as well. So again, my name is Arhin Acheampong, and I am Deputy Director of the Afro-Sino Center of International Relations, where we do extensive research on Africa-China engagements. And again, as a result of that, the issue of multilateralism and the alternatives that Africa seeks and Africa is looking for becomes very central in the kind of work and research that we do. Let me start off by actually asking some questions to put this into perspectives in answering the question, what should the Africa agenda be in the reform of international systems, including the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council. Now, the question is how the international system regard or view Africa currently. I argue that mostly Africa is considered as or treated as a problem that needs to be addressed, or one that the world needs to find solutions to. But on the contrary, Africa is well suited to solve most of the world's problems, and it's essential in finding answers to global challenges like climate change, insecurity, human rights concerns. Now, Africa and Africans must first recognize this and believe this to be true. When this happens, African leaders can then brainstorm policy from this point of view. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, which struck the world, President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa lamented how Africans and its leaders were treated, noting that the paternalistic view or relationship between Western countries and Africa have hindered the continent's ability to position itself as a relevant stakeholder within the international system. Now, President Ramaphosa was talking about Africa's quest to lead its own manufacture of COVID-19 vaccines. And the rest of the world were telling Africa that it should rather stick with packaging if it wanted to be involved in the packaging of vaccines and not the production of vaccines. So this is a continent that is trying to contribute to a global pandemic, but it's not allowed to do that. Now, when this happens, what we see is that the continent is relegated to the background again with that context that was created, that it is seen as a continent that needs solutions to be found for and not one to contribute to global solutions. And so I argue that Africa should take advantage of its numbers in the United Nations, as well as leverage its united front as a union to demand and shape the United Nations and other international systems when necessary. That is generally saying that Africa should use that mixed approach of, when necessary, come together as a united force, as a union, and when necessary also use its individual voices and its numbers as 55 independent African countries to demand the change that they require. Now, one important thing is that Africa's diversity should be harnessed by encouraging intra-African engagements, including exchange programs at both low and high levels, promoting people-to-people engagements amongst Africans. And this can be done by leveraging the African Continental Free Trade Area and also encouraging students to study in other African countries. Now, I make this argument and I say that once this is done, the African can appreciate the solutions and the problems of other Africans. It will make the African appreciate the diversity of the continent and also respect what brings the continent together. The connection between and amongst Africans is so limited that the African struggles to have a single voice or an agenda that seeks to advance the continental agenda, which is stipulated in the Agenda 2063. Now, I also postulate that Africa's agenda in the reform of the United Nations should be well spelled out, coordinated, and aligned with this continental agenda stipulated in Agenda 2063. Africa has its agenda, and so it will be very good to always or mainly maintain that Agenda 2063 so that the African Agenda 2063 does not get lost in all these multilateral agreements and engagement that Africa has with other powers like FOCAC and the BRICS. So Africa must put the African Agenda 2063 as its forefront and as its blueprint in shaping all these other engagements. I also argue that an interconnected Africa is invaluable in positioning Africa. And then finally, as part of efforts to secure seats at the Security Council, Africa could and should probably consider being represented as a union, such as mirroring the EU in the G20, instead of struggling to find which countries to be represented at the Security Council. Africa could brainstorm or consider being represented at the Security Council as a union. I think these would be my initial thoughts, and then I look forward to addressing some of the other points that I have here. Thank you.
Excellent. I mean, that does raise a lot of questions. Africa as a bloc being represented on the Security Council, simply because, as you've said, the divisions, the alliances within Africa, one wonders how that would work. But I think that's something we can expand upon in the discussions. So thank you, Mr. Acheampong. I'm going to call on two people. I did not realize that Bob Wekesa, who is one of the founding members, is with the University of Witwatersrand, is on the call. And he's in Nairobi right now. And also Christina Rutwa, Executive Director of the Tanzania Network of Legal Aid Providers. Bob, I'd like to call on you first to say a few words, and then to Christina, who has some thoughts on this as well.
Thank you very much, and thanks, colleagues. I hope you can hear me. Let me start by asking if you can hear me first.
We can.
Yes.
All right, and I'm saying that because I'm actually in Kampala on some research mission, and the internet here is not very multilateral. Which tells you that geopolitics can face digital challenges. But I suppose mine is just to say that from my previous colleagues' interventions, I think Africa loves multilateralism because when you are weak in the international system, you kind of rely on a more global architecture or mechanism under which you could perhaps thrive. However, what we have seen in recent times is that instead of multilateralism led at the UN level with the AU at the forefront, we have a position where we now have Africa Plus. So for instance, over the weekend and last week, we had Russia plus 17 African countries. Some people have said actually the Russia-Africa summit was a flop because it was the least with only 17 countries, including the leader of this country where I am, Yoweri Museveni, being, attending. But nonetheless, it just goes to demonstrate that instead of multilateralism at the UN in New York or any other UN agencies, including those in Nairobi and Rome and so forth, we now have a situation where Africa looks either to DC or to Delhi for the India-Africa Summit and the India-Africa relations, or to Beijing for the big one called FOCAC, and the EU, Brussels. So we have a situation where multilateralism is now beginning to look like Africa and any one of those big powers, rather than multilateralism that is based on norms of global governance that were instituted by the United Nations. Now, related to that is the fact that Africa is now being pulled into the direction of the reform of the UN. And what my colleague mentioned there was reform of the United Nations Security Council is almost like a bait. But there are some powers, China specifically, Russia also, that look to reform the UN system, which is the seat for multilateralism, in a certain way, in a way that kind of flouts certain tenets of human rights and democracy. I'm just thinking aloud, for example, the challenge to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as one of those issues. issues to do, for example, a redefinition of issues such as freedom of expression and other rights. So much so that now the reform of the UN and therefore the multilateral system is taking shape under a new mechanism in which Africa is pulled in different directions according to global powers. So this is a very interesting dynamic, because that whole narrative, particularly the one that talks of Africa as being part of the global South with China, Brazil, and so forth, is gaining currency, and it kind of resonates in African capitals, because many of these African countries, leaders particularly, are of the view that multilateralism has worked best for the global North and not the global South. So that begins to look like global tensions arising out of multilateralism that seems not to have worked, in some respects not worked for Africa, in some respects not worked for other global powers. And therefore, there's a solidarity of certain powers with the African continent to try and change that system. And that pits Africa against global powers, including the US, the Europe, and so forth. And so I think the African perspective is therefore lost in between these two positions. The position where it is to go with the West or the global North more particularly, and so-called global South, in which Africa itself is considered to be a part. And as with the many years that we have seen during the Cold War and so forth, Africa finds itself in the middle in these circumstances. And I think those are my very brief interventions. I will chip in again at a later stage. But thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Bob. Let's turn to Christina Rudwa. If you're prepared to just say a few words, and then we'll come back for a second round.
I think she stepped out for a while.
Oh, she stepped out. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you all for really kind of setting a great base for the discussion. The thing kind of that stands out for me is kind of who is going to drive this vision that you lay out, Bob, or that you've each laid out of kind of the reform. One of the things I think that we haven't really seen in recent years as much. Back in the day, you know, in 2000, we had a number of African leaders who really set themselves up to kind of drive and be the key interlocutors between, you know, Africa and the globe. And so the founders of NEPAD, for example, you know, with all their flaws, but Thabo Mbeki and Wad, Obasanjo, there were a few key states that kind of stepped up to kind of try to shape this new order. And I wonder if we're seeing kind of who might lead that. Who are we seeing stepping up to this? Obviously, Cyril Ramaphosa has had a strong voice on this. And how might that come about? But the second that all of your interventions kind of raised to me is this possibility of kind of a bifurcated or trifurcated or very divided Africa. It's very hard to envision a kind of a consensus on some of the global norms when you look at Africa today. The big news, you know, this past week was the coup in Niger. And interestingly, ECOWAS has come out and said a very strong statement saying this cannot stand. We'll give you a week, and if no action is taken to restore the constitutional order, ECOWAS will use all means necessary, including the use of force, they explicitly say. So, you know, you have a continent where kind of norms on human rights, on civil liberty, on sovereignty are kind of divided and contested within the continent itself. So I wonder how that might shape some of these global debates. I wonder if we maybe go back to Priyal Singh, who I think made the very good point, or that there's a tendency to look for alternative, but kind of what is the positive, what are the positive values or norms or institutions that alternative should have? Is it just an alternative because we're sick of the current world order? What is the aspiration ultimately, or what might that be? What are some of the options for that? Priyal, maybe we can come back to you on kind of some of your thinking on that, or what are the forces that might shape that?
Sure. Look, I think it's important for us to recognize that the foundations of the current international system, as enshrined within the UN Charter, is something that is good and needs to be protected and upheld. And I think most countries in the world would readily agree that what we have at the base of the current international order is something that is good and worth preserving and worth recommitting to. At the other hand, the second point I'd like to make is that we should also be realistic and pragmatic in understanding Africa as a collective bloc. As Prof. Wekesa mentioned, many African states are comparatively very weak international actors on their own and need to come together to leverage their collective weight and agency on the world stage in order to pursue their collective interests. But at the same time, we need to remember that 54, 55 countries to have a common position and a coherent approach and understanding on varied international policy issues is something that it's simply unrealistic. There's no way a country like South Africa, which, to be fair, we do have a very progressive democratic constitution. These values are simply not reflected in many other countries around the continent. I mean, South Africa was one of the first countries to, legalize gay marriage, and those types of issues don't find traction all across the continent. So we need to be realistic and pragmatic with what we can expect African countries to collectively band around and pursue on the international stage. The third point I'd like to make is that, and it's linked to the first point, that the change we want to see in the international system, and especially the multilateral system, I don't think necessarily needs to be, it should be pursued by Africa and it should be pursued by the global South. But I think we should also look at countries in the global North, powerful countries in the international system right now, and look at, just put a spotlight on some of those countries withdrawing from multilateralism themselves. Because by those countries withdrawing from multilateralism in recent years, creates a double standard, and it undermines the credibility and legitimacy of many multilateral institutions that all countries in the world need to subscribe to and play by common rules and play by common values. And again, this comes down to the International Criminal Court adhering to the principles of the UN in pursuing just wars, just conflicts, and so on. And I think if there's a common standard that we can consistently subscribe to and respect, we won't be constantly be having these kinds of discussions, constantly calling for the need for reform. Although there is, absolutely a vital need for reform, but I think this comes down to the credibility and legitimacy of international institutions and how they may have been undermined by powerful countries in the international system. And that has created deep suspicions and frustrations by countries in the global South to subscribe to institutions or respect multilateral institutions that are actually not respected or subscribed to by the most dominant and powerful international actors in the global system. I'll stop there. Thank you.
You make a great point. I mean, multilateral institutions perhaps empower the weaker states, but also they constrain the more powerful. And so how can, powerful states be convinced to give up some of their autonomy to protect the broader system? And I think that's very much in question. Archie, do you want to respond to some of that, kind of the divisions within Africa and priorities that you might see shaping? Oops.
We may have to ask him to log out and log back in.
Okay.
I think it's his internet system.
Okay, have you messaged him to that?
Yeah, I will.
Okay, so Bob, maybe we come back to you on that, and then we'll open up for kind of discussion, because I'm sure there's good questions within the room.
All right, thanks, Jennifer. I think my starting point is, we have to talk interests here. Even as we talk of multilateralism as led by the so-called global South, Africa, and the global North. So what will be the interests, African interests? And I think it is in the self-interest of countries such as the US and Western Europe, or global North more broadly, to identify areas in which reforms at the UN that benefit Africa will be in their self-interest, but also in the interest of Africa. Because if that is not done, what the alternative will kick in, which is that the reforms that Africans are clamoring for will be generated in Beijing or in Moscow or in New Delhi and other places. And this is for the simple reason. I think that's the realistic viewpoint. As to your question of how who will drive the African reform process, I don't see that happening, and I think I'm pretty much with my colleague Priyal here in saying that African countries are enfeebled right now. We are seeing all these chain reactions and coups across the Sahel, and many could follow. I mean, we don't want to be prophets of doom, but the circumstances that led to the coups and instability in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Guinea, Sudan are also available in many other places. So I think it's almost a return to the coup era on the continent in the 1980s. As to the question of leadership, another factor here is that the continent is much weaker than the early 2000s when we transitioned from the OAU to the AU. When we had the leadership of, as Jennifer, ably mentioned, of Abdoulaye Wade and Thabo Mbeki and Olusegun Obasanjo. We do not have a clear leader right now. South Africa has always played a key role. President Ramaphosa seems to want to continue playing that role, but the strained relations with with the US, more specifically, and the controversies around South Africa's engagements with Russia and China, particularly Russia in recent times, have kind of reduced South Africa's stature. You like it or not? I mean, it's not the most ideal situation. The leaders who led the global charge, as it were, who are on the forefront of amplifying African voice, have also now accumulated a lot of baggage. We are talking Paul Kagame, we're talking Yoweri Museveni, who are the darlings of the West and a global, world. I mean, who had a vision and were very exciting speakers a couple of years. Now, I think they have, they have overstayed in power and so forth. I think if you ask me, some of the leaders that one can have hope for leading the charge globally, and here let me declare that I am Kenyan, but I think William Ruto seems to be making the right noises. And but again, he faces challenges at home because there have been protests led by Raila Odinga. So it's not a clean sweep there. We have Hakainde Hichilema from Zambia. But again, I think he could be a leader on the global stage. amplifying and articulating African positions. But at the same time, we have to face the reality that Zambia is a far smaller economy that is not really an anchor country. I mean, with due respect to my Zambian friends, we can actually argue about that. And so it appears to me the African position on the global stage with regards to multilateralism will be a matter that will continue the narrative of Africa either following a Western position or a global South position. And I think we see that already in the voting patterns on matters of human rights and matters, discussions about climate change and so forth. So I think it's realistic at this point in time to say that Africa will follow, will actually be inclined, will be aligned with a position taken by one of the global powers. So the question then, going back to where I started, which of the global powers has the best interest of Africa at heart? I think that's where I'll stop. Thank you.
Okay, interesting. You know, at one of our previous sessions, Professor Gilbert Kadiagala raised the idea of kind of positive neutrality. And rather than just kind of a knee-jerk revisionist or rejection of one bloc or the other because of kind of longstanding ideological, where's the, you know, can you have kind of a more pragmatic, positive engagement that doesn't kind of confine a country to one bloc or the other? And we discussed President Ruto in that, who is, you know, who will engage with Russia, engage with China big time, but is also in Israel looking at ways to, you know, on desertification, is in Holland, is in Europe, is kind of looking to the players, how best can Kenya benefit from these various players, rather than kind of tying yourself whole hog or this uncritical embrace of one bloc or the other. And I mean, I think that's my sense is that the more strategic path of taking what's best from the various blocs and to the benefit of the own country is probably the one that will benefit in the long run, rather than tying your hands to one power or the other. What I'd like to do, because I don't think Christina is on yet, but we can come back to the question. I'd like to take some questions and comments from the folks here. And I'm sorry that I've kind of had my back to you. I'm looking at the screen. So should we start with Dan and then to the gentleman there? So Dan.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'm Dan Whitman, a loyal follower of the USC programs here. You've all made very powerful points, and you've revealed to me a profound contradiction, which you have talked about but have not named. Professor Singh began this discussion by citing the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and he didn't say so, but we know that the support on the part of the majority of African countries, or let's say the resistance to the idea of changing borders, was universal. The most eloquent statement made on this issue was made by the Kenyan delegate to the UN, who talked about the AU policy of not changing borders, even if the borders make no sense culturally or historically, because changing a border will lead to conflict and sometimes genocide. You've all made a powerful point about the need for a clear agenda. We see the consensus absolutely in shambles on this issue. When Linda Thomas Greenfield tried to reason and tried to make an argument in favor of a uniform policy on the part of African countries, she was accused of being paternalistic. We know that Russia provides less than 1% of international trade for Africa, and we see that certainly behind many of the coups, who gains from this? Russia does, as the French embassy in Niamey is surrounded and trashed. We know that people in Moscow like this. So my question is, this is a huge contradiction. Number one, the African need, this is not an abstraction, this is a fundamental principle, don't change borders, versus the need for consensus on international issues. I think, initially there was a kind of a consensus. It's now gone. Where do you see this going in the next few months? Thanks.
Should we take a couple of questions or should we go, but that's a big one. But let's take two and then we'll go back to the panel as you kind of muddle it over. Yes.
Yes, Jennifer.
Is a mic coming or can they hear?
They can hear.
They can hear, okay. Great.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Jennifer. I'm just excited about the program. Every time I come to California, I always love to be here, and I'm USC alumni. My question is, we talk. I mean, you mentioned one image. I think it was Priyal. You had mentioned about where African countries can band together. What are your thoughts about opportunities around healthcare? And the reason why I point that out, one success I've seen already in healthcare, I spend a lot of time in Africa on the continent through my company. Around PEPFAR, that's one excellent example where countries band together in partnership with the United States and President Bush around the PEPFAR initiative, and we've had huge influence with that project. The second one, I just had the pleasure. I do a lot of Alzheimer's consulting work right now for a young biotech company out of La Jolla, and we have a promising molecule. So I just got back from South Africa before going to the Alzheimer's Association International Conference. We're hoping to have discussions with Aspa Farm Care, the largest pharmaceutical company on the continent of Africa. Again, Alzheimer's doesn't discriminate, but there was an amazing group that I met in December, my first trip overseas post-COVID in December. This group is doing amazing work. It's 9 African nations. And we had a chance to get together in Amsterdam at the Alzheimer's Association International Conference, but they're doing amazing work. I mean, the conference back in December, this group's been together for a while on low to medium income countries, but even partners brought in with the program to the University of Miami in collaboration, coming from Colombia, various other nations in Southeast Asia, but I was just blown away. I came not expecting, just to keep open eyes and open ears, and I was just blown away by what I saw. So I'm praying that our company in the area of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's that will be able to partner with Aspa Farm Care and come up with a solution where Africa can surely, as I believe after leaving that conference, have a true seat at the table in innovation and healthcare. Thank you.
Great. Should we take one more? One thing I hope you've all read recently, kind of PEPFAR, potentially PEPFAR renewal being potentially at risk because of ideological challenges here in the United States over the idea that somehow the program is promoting abortion. And it's actually a serious threat to one of the probably the most successful U.S. Health initiatives ever. I beg your pardon?
And security.
And security, yeah. So keep an eye on that in the coming weeks. Should we take one more and then turn back? Yes, sir.
Question. I wonder, I understand how politically 55 nations could not agree on multiple points.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry, Benjamin Davis. I'm the chair of the Multimedia Journalism Department at Morgan State University. I understand how politically you can't get so many nations to unite on political issues, but there are areas that have been proven where things can happen, where progress can be made. In the case of Kenya and 5G and Ghana and 3G and 4G and now 5G. I'm wondering if creating a digital backbone across the continent is something that would unify all the nations, because wherever there is 5G, soon to be 6G, which would be mostly commerce. If they can agree on that, that alone brings prosperity. It's almost by default.
Great. Let's take this first round and good questions, and then we'll go to, so there's some folks with questions online and in the audience. So first is this idea, the norm around sanctity of borders, like where did that go? I think that was the question. And then both of these last questions kind of consensus and common action around some very pragmatic issues that are in kind of win-win across the continent, I think is kind of the gist there. So should we turn back? Bob, you're on the screen right now. Should we start with you and then turn to Priya?
All right, no, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks, colleagues, for those very insightful and good questions. I think to start with Dan, the question of sanctity of borders, particularly with respect to the Russia matter. I think one has to just go back to the immediate point, which is that if you look at things have, okay, let me put it this way. Things have changed since the invasion February 2022, in the sense that at the Russia-Africa summit, how many countries attended? 17. And which were these countries? They included Eritrea, the military leaderships of Burkina Faso and so forth that are pariah states, more or less. So which countries did not attend? We didn't see Kenya, Tanzania, Ghana, Zambia, and so forth. So out of 55, 17 attended. That tells you that with matters Russia, matters Africa, Russia is on a very major back footing, and it might be related to its own involvement in the Ukraine war. And the recent developments, including Wagner Group and its meltdown out there in Russia itself. But to the substantive issue of borders in a more principle-related kind of way, I think ultimately African countries take positions based on who is their ally at one particular moment in time, and that can shift from one week to the other. So much so that we see, for example, the foreign minister of Russia visiting countries, and those countries that might have taken one position kind of shift overnight. That goes back to tell you that principle might be a very difficult thing to sustain in circumstances when you have economic weaknesses. So much so that sometimes your own evaluation of who is my ally is very ephemeral. It's almost a daily struggle. If you're not sure how you're going to pay civil servant salaries next month, or you have a food crisis, then principle kind of sometimes takes a backseat, unfortunately. I think some of these leaders face the reality of, am I going to let my people die of hunger on the basis of principle? And so forth. Of course, I'm not trying to defend this. I'm trying to look at, if you are a leader in a state house, you are the president, you are looking at the realities as they are before you in the moment. And so much so that even, because of course, I think Dan and many colleagues understand that after the wars of liberation of the African continent, after colonialism, African countries agreed that they will not change borders, even if they had been, made arbitrarily in the 1884 Berlin Conference. But I think that principle can change if circumstances demand so. I think on the issue of health, more broadly, the big issue, of course, is again financing of health programs on the African continent. Of course, PEPFAR has been greatly successful. I'm learning actually as we speak that it is under siege, or it's not assured anymore. That's PEPFAR on the basis of ideological understandings. But more broadly, I think the financing of WHO is a big deal for African countries, but also programs at the UN level, such as UNICEF and so forth. And the challenge has been that many big powers equally have a problem remitting monies into the WHO. I think we saw that during the Trump administration, but more broadly, it has become very difficult to do global health programs that are beneficial to Africa at the UN level. So in addition to that, as we saw during the COVID-19 period, there was all these issues about access to vaccines. Africans, I think, remain bitter to some extent, particularly those who are involved at the forefront, that they couldn't access vaccines when they needed them most because pharmaceutical companies were saying, no, look, we need to make money out of this, for example, or that or that some global powers were saying, look, we start with our own population first, you come last. And I think so there's been an attempt to ensure health security on the continent by boosting vaccine production and so forth. It's very feeble and so forth, but it is an indication again that African continent relying on other powers might be a challenge. To some extent, China has also stepped into that space. so that, for example, malaria, which is a big problem of the continent, China has stepped in a big way, actually. I think there's a colleague called Deborah Brottingham who has done quite a bit of work on this, whom I can refer to, to just demonstrate that where there is a gap, someone will fill it. In some respects, it has been China. I think to the last point of, acting, unity of 55 countries being difficult, I'll make 2 points very quickly. One is that the African Union has understood very well that you can agree as a continent of 55 on certain issues, but some other issues can only be agreed on at the Regional Economic Commission community level. Of the 5 economic communities, in fact, there are 6 if you consider diaspora, which the AU considers the 6th region. And then of course we have at national level, engagement between a country and other countries and so forth. So I think there's no contradiction that you can have a collective African voice on certain issues. The UN Security Council, for example, you can have a collective position at a regional level. For example, ECOWAS and the Cooke in Niger, I think the East African community is not on the forefront at that level. But also you can agree on with the global powers, or you can undertake bilateral relations. The DRC, for example, being a mineral-rich country, can enter relations that might be slightly different from Eritrea, which has no major minerals as such. And so the proposition of digital platforms coming into play is an interesting one. But I think from a multilateral perspective, digital technologies as a glue for the continent is interesting. But again, one has to be careful here to consider the fact that 70% of Africa's 5G or 4G technologies, and even going into 5G technologies, have been supplied by Chinese companies, some of which are actually banned in the US, including Huawei and ZTE. I think that's one point to consider. And I think I'll conclude by pointing out that in the digital humanities or digital politics, call it what you may, what has emerged very clearly is that we have 2 visions. One is that we have digital neutrality or digital universality, in which, but this is a narrative, this is a position taken particularly by the US to say there are certain values like democracy and human rights that must play in the ICT, in the digital sphere. But this is against the narrative from China, which is increasingly very enticing to African countries, that says that you can actually have digital sovereignty, that you can have digital technologies and use them as you wish. And without going into examples, this second perspective has led to many problems, including denying Africans freedom of expression and so forth. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
And on the digital, I think one of our future sessions of the forum is going to be focused on digital transformation. So it's a good one to be thinking about. Meanwhile,
We have to come back.
okay, all right, let's go to Priyal.
Sure. Yeah, to respond to some of the very interesting questions. I think the first question on the sanctity of borders and where to next for African states with respect to their positioning on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think the sanctity of borders is a very interesting question, because it also raises a very interesting parallel with why don't African states view Russia as an abusive imperial power, for example. That's a question we often receive. And my immediate response is that when we look at the justifications of votes provided by African states on within the General Assembly, whether African states voted in favor of resolutions condemning Russian aggression or whether they abstained, the justifications were all actually quite similar. And a common thread that cut across most of those justifications was that African states were not willing to pursue any course of action or position or endorse any form of resolution that validates or legitimizes a military response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Because African states kind of collectively, in their collective skepticism of Western military interventionism, viewed that a military response to this would just pull both parties away from the negotiating table. And that is something that is simply not conducive to any form of peace in the immediate or medium term. So I think that's one point I'd like to make. The second point, and again, it relates to positioning around the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is that on paper, this should be a very clear-cut issue. We should expect African states in their reading of the UN Charter to say this was a clear violation of international law, it was a clear violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity and so on. And especially for countries like South Africa, democracies that are guided by democratic, progressive, constitutional values, this should be a very clear-cut issue. But just one point I'd like to put forward to the audience is that, again, I'm not speaking for all African states, speaking specifically for South Africa and maybe a handful of other African states, is that there's a tension in our foreign policy right now. On the one hand, we have our progressive democratic constitutional values. And on the other hand, we have the worldview of political elites within our country that is grounded in the values and principles enshrined in the liberation movements. In South Africa, we have the ANC that fought against apartheid, that is a liberation party. And their worldview of the international order is fundamentally premised on what is their ideological commitment to progressive internationalism. So South Africa's engagements with Africa are informed by Pan-Africanism, but South Africa's engagements with the rest of the world is fundamentally understood through the prism of progressive internationalism, which is based on a view of the international order that seeks to guard against the abuses of imperial power that is fundamentally based on the US and the European Union. And again, this is the ANC. It's not South African foreign policy, but it's the worldview of the ruling political party in South Africa. And my argument is that there's two problems here. The first problem is that the ANC has not updated its view on progressive internationalism since the 1970s. And secondly, this is the only frame of reference. It is the only worldview that the ANC uses to understand the contemporary international system. And as the old saying goes, if the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So, currently in South Africa, our biggest issue, foreign policy issue when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, is reconciling these two seemingly irreconcilable things: the worldview of the ANC and our progressive constitutional values, which should in fact be the guiding lights of our international relations. So I think that explains away some of these issues. The second question on PEPFAR, I think, is a very interesting one. Certainly, there's not a lot of debate or discussion on this in South Africa. Our big focus right now is on AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, and South Africa's continuing inclusion in AGOA. But I think these kinds of instruments by the United States are absolutely vital. It does provide a lot of goodwill and good faith and the rest of it, and it's absolutely vital. And the third question, will 5G help countries to better coordinate and cohere their positions? I would say it's an interesting observation, it's an interesting argument, but I would disagree. I don't think a revolution in telecoms would necessarily help transform our geopolitics or our collective positioning within multilateral institutions, because a technological revolution is going to fundamentally benefit people on the ground, and that will have a transformative effect on society if these countries are democracies. which is not the case in Africa at the moment. Certainly, there are a number of democracies, but there are far too many autocracies and closed repressive societies in Africa right now. So even if there was a telecoms revolution, and it does benefit people, the countries themselves will first need to transform in order for them to cohere their efforts on the global stage. So I think there's a number of steps that needs to be taken before this kind of telecoms revolution is going to affect our collective politics on the world stage. Yeah, I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Archie, I believe you're back.
Awesome. So I really would like to respond to Dan's question on Africa's response in the Russia-Ukrainian war, and whether or not it was a reflection of priorities or principles being thrown out the door. And I think Singh did a very good job of addressing that question. I think that the responses and the reaction, the aftermath of Africa's vote on Russia-Ukraine highlighted a very important point, that there are always going to be repercussions for Africans in the way they independently think about issues or vote on issues. And I think that if you look at the responses and the justifications that African nations gave as to how they voted, if you ask me as an international security analyst, I think most of them were country-specific, tailor-made, based on their historic or current circumstances. And there isn't a lot of evidence to suggest that if it were any other country but Russia, these votes would have been would have seen a different trend in voting patterns. And so the idea that there's all these rivalries, right, between emerging and old powers puts Africa in a position where the countries within Africa are expected by powers to vote in a specific way that seems to benefit them or that aligns with their interests, without really giving Africans the benefit of the doubt to want to understand their logic or their reasoning behind the way they decide to do things or to vote on such relevant issues. And again, it goes back to Ramaphosa's comment about the paternalistic relationship, where there's expectations not as partners, but expectations as quote unquote subordinates, that you have to vote in this way to suit A or B interest. And the interest of the African is sort of relegated to the background. And so as Mr. Singh rightly sort of put into perspectives, there were several reasons and there were several justifications for why African leaders voted the way they did. And I think that the way Africans voted was quite remarkable. And it would serve the rest of the world if we really went into it to understand why the vote went the way it did. And definitely Professor Wekesa points to some of those. I mean, there were some bread and butter issues in there, but most importantly, and to some of them, there were historical and existing reasons for that. And I think that, like I said in my initial comments, that where necessary, Africa should leverage its united voice. And when it becomes important, Africa should stick with its individual voices like they did in the Russia-Ukraine vote. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Let's turn to questions from online. We have Tim Goller. And then yes, the gentleman there. Okay, so we'll go for 4 this time, if that's okay. Tim Goller, are you online?
I am. Thank you so much. My name is Dr. Tim Goller. I am a professor of sociology and director of the Center for African American Public Policy at Norfolk State University. Thank you so much for this opportunity to ask the question. I mean, building on this, the idea of reconciling, and also what Brother Wekesa mentioned about speaking of realities in the moment, in particular, the global north, specifically the United States. My question is, how does the US, how does the United States, foster a greater respect and understanding and cooperation with Africa amidst its own internal political divisiveness, and racial climate, and overcome the perceived hypocrisy?
Big question. Thank you, Doctor. Let's turn next to Michael Walsh.
Hi, Michael Walsh. I'm a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I wanted to ask about sort of the narratives that are going around. Hypocrisy is one of them, but Russian political elites are working hard to use another narrative, the anti-colonial narrative, in their campaign to change the world order. This was clear in the comments by Yevgeny Prigozhin in the aftermath of the Niger coup. So how big of a risk do these narratives pose to US interests in sub-Saharan Africa? And to what extent do you see others, including Chinese political elites, parroting this narrative?
Great, thank you, Michael. And then we have the gentleman in the room. Yes, oh, I can't.
Wasn't jumping here.
Thank you so much. My name is Nabiyu Daniel. I was Ethiopian former diplomat. My question is on disinformation. We often see when disinformation affects multilateralism beyond hurting individual African countries. I was surprised to see on Ethiopian news 3 days ago that Russia and Ethiopia agreed to tackle a dissemination of false information at the global level. And I consider that actually an extension of disinformation campaign from Russia. My question is, how is it possible to tackle disinformation that's affecting the sovereignty of African citizens and protect their interests? Thank you.
Great, very good question. Thank you, Nabe. And then the lady in the front.
Okay, you come to the table. So this information here.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Myrtle Alexander, Institute for Academic Management. My question refers to a lot that's been said this morning with regards to Africa becoming a United States of Africa per se. And the reason I pose this question is I'm hearing India, Africa, US, Africa, Beijing, Africa, Russian, Africa, everything but Africa, Africa. And then one statement was made about Africa being pulled in different directions, which denotes something towards divide and conquer within Africa. And so how does one approach the unity of Africa? I know it's been touched on by many of the presenters, both here and online. How does one start that process with Africa being the most populous nation, above China, above India, but yet not being able to have a unity within Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's turn back to our questions. So Dr. Goller, a big question on kind of US credibility and in some of these global discussions, given the domestic issues that we are been grappling with these many decades and our increased political polarization in the recent decades. So I don't know if that's a question that's to some extent for US policy, but maybe we'll give, should we start with Bob on that one? I know you've looked at that
All
to
right.
some extent.
Okay,
Public
no,
diplomacy in the age of US polarization and
thanks for, indeed, that is a big question, one that we can discuss for ages. But I think the long and short of it is that the question as framed is, how does the US foster greater partnership with Africa when it has many domestic problems that are of concern? I'll add this. This is paraphrasing, really. Let me not put words into Dr. Gola's mouth. But in terms of paraphrasing, I mean, let's just start with the Supreme Court rulings that happened this summer. You know, one of which were, for example, on LGBTQ issues. Which suggest that the conservatives on the Supreme Court want to uphold the values of, that run counter to LGBTQ kind of liberal thinking. So, I mean, that puts the US into a direct conflict on the African continent, where it's trying to say LGBTQ rights are rights like any other. Because then, or let's take the example of the many racial challenges that African Americans face. That kind of quickly runs counter to the problem that the US foreign policy has promulgated, as released last year, and even during the summit in December, seems to suggest that one of the foreign policy assets is diaspora, because of the natural affinities and connections. Yet there are those racial issues that the US itself is grappling with at home. And I think one can go on and on. There are many issues. I mean, the January 6th insurrection against the idea that there's election fraud on the continent and the US is sending observer missions. Africans will say, no, look, we need to come and actually observe your elections to make sure you're not running counter to, good practice. So for that reason, I think, and of course, the Biden has come up with the Summit for Democracy to try and tackle some of those issues. I suppose the way forward, and it is not necessarily the only solution, is to say that the US leaders on either side of the political divide to be candid and say we are facing many problems. We admit we do have problems, and we do not have solutions for you as Africans, or we're not trying to export our values, and that we want to think through these issues collectively. I think that some level of being genuine will be understood, so you can tell Africans that we want to work together on these issues to find solutions together, rather than posing we have the answers and you can only listen, because then, the realities do not jibe with that, perspective. I think to Michael's point of the anti-colonial narrative, I think it's a very easy access, very easy entry, point, because Africans remember, and African Americans for that matter. In fact, there's a whole notion of global Africa. Africans everywhere in the world remember that there was such a thing as slavery, which devastated the continent. And so actors such as Russia understand the emotive aspect of this and will mine all the potential that comes with it. In fact, last week when there was that coup in Niger, in Niamey, the crowds out in the street, some of them were actually chanting pro-Russia, platitudes and slogans and so forth, in the context of an anti-French kind of narrative, and that to some extent, therefore, the anti-colonial or anti-colonial narrative, if I may put it, is a very easy entry point because it touches on raw nerves that still, and there are many things we can say about the evils of colonialism. And despite the fact that, in fact, the US stood on the right side of history, in terms of the anti-colonial narrative and so forth, the thing is that you just have to remind people that the African Americans in the US that might be facing racial discrimination, whether it's right or wrong, whether it is extensive or not, you have a position there. In fact, now that ties in with Nebiyu's question around disinformation and misinformation. In essence, the Russians, particularly through the Wagner group, have mined such narratives such as, the Africa not having benefited much from its relations with the West, for example, or capitalism and exploitation and those kinds of narratives to spin the narrative, which is essentially what disinformation is, that you have a situation that is dicey, then you kind of create some false narrative around it and sustain it with ill intention. And I think that the response there, therefore, will be to kind of develop genuine relations and trying to explain ourselves much more. In fact, the bigger context, therefore, is that just as we have conventional wars on the battlefield, we have information wars, and there's the new form of information wars. I know that there are my colleagues from the public diplomacy end of things in the room, quite a good number, and they understand pretty much that we are in an information war, particularly in the digital era, that becomes another layer. In fact, cybersecurity is a related matter and so forth. I think lastly, to the question of United States of Africa, I think this is a project from back in the day that never quite took off. In fact, that relates back to Dan's question of borders, because of course, as we remember, there was a split in independence era leaders with people, where some leaders were for immediate unification of the continent, and that included Kwame Nkrumah. But then there are those that insisted, that thought that it would be unwise to try to unite the entire continent at once, because it was not very practical, and it will cause many problems, led by Nyerere and others. And I think that project seems to have come to some kind of temporary conclusion, for lack of a better phrase, in the sense that Africans now are almost comfortable with the fact that they will live as South Africans, as Namibians, and so forth. What is increasingly becoming the case of unification of the continent is through projects such as the African Continental Free Trade Area, such as the African Passport, and there are a number of positions. So the integration of the continent through trade is being considered a much more realistic approach. But overall, said and done, the biggest problem is that we have a very weak continental entity, continental government in Addis Ababa called the African Union. And I think we can go on and on about its weakness, but I'll stop there to give a chance to my colleagues. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Let's turn to Priyal, and maybe you can talk about the first two questions, which are really about kind of narrative. Dr. Groller's question, Michael Walsh's question about narratives around colonization, how effective is it? And from a US policy standpoint, kind of what is an effective kind of counter, or let's say not counter narrative, but strategic narrative. We've got one of the experts on strategic narratives here in the room, Matt Levenger from GW. So perhaps you can speak about this kind of grand narratives question.
Sure. I think, the main points I'd like to make is that, well, firstly, the Chinese and Russian political narratives absolutely have a lot of traction around the continents. And this is not necessarily based on the attractiveness of their narratives, of their arguments. It's fundamentally based on the unattractiveness of the current narratives from Western partners and their failure to gain traction in Africa at the moment. And the reason I say this is because Prof. Wekesa mentioned, long-standing historical issues, around slavery and that kind of historical baggage that still exists. But I'd go further and I'd say that, we don't have to even look back that far. Currently in South Africa, if we had to look at the median age of policymakers, of political elites in our country at the moment, these were all people that had firsthand personal experiences with Western aggression or Western abuses of power. Many of the current leaders in our governments at the moment were branded terrorists by the United States. You know, the ANC was banned, you know, by the National Party many years ago, and you know, but even by your Foreign Secretary Blinken's own admission just a few months ago, it was mentioned that the US was far too sympathetic to the apartheid regime in South Africa. And, you know, our current leaders have firsthand personal experience with that, and they remember that. So again, this is reflected not so much in official South African foreign policy, but again, if we go into the policy of the ruling African National Congress, when it comes to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the ANC officially views what's going on in Ukraine as a proxy war, not as an isolated war of aggression between Ukraine and Russia, but as a proxy war primarily between the United States, its NATO allies, and Russia. And that is official ANC policy in South Africa right now. And, you know, so, you know, again, to come to the point, this Russian narrative, the Chinese narrative, absolutely find traction amongst many former liberation movements that are currently in power right now, based on their recent historical experiences with Western powers. So I think I'd just throw that out. On the disinformation question, I often argue, you know, it is slightly overstated in the sense that I think we often attribute or try to attribute too much to the positions of African states based on disinformation coming from Moscow, as opposed to, you know, the actual agency and decision-making powers within the continent just simply not wanting to take a position that is aligned or in agreement with Western partners. But absolutely, you know, disinformation is a huge issue, and we do need to tackle this. I think Prof. Wekesa covered that, so I won't go into too much detail. And then finally, the last point was on, you know, Africa being disunited or not very united on the world stage. Again, I think it's important for us to be realistic and pragmatic in our assessment of the continent at large. Many countries are simply not united. There are major internal conflicts, political disagreements, historical issues amongst African states themselves. South Africa, for example, you know, supports the freedom and liberation of Western Sahara, which puts it in a very kind of a difficult position with Morocco and Algeria and you know, other countries in that region. And these disagreements play out at a continental level within the structures of the African Union, within the UN system itself. So absolutely, I mean, these are you know, long-standing issues, and you know, surely, I mean, African states can be united on some issues, on various normative issues and so on. But for us to expect that the continent will be a United States of Africa with some kind of, you know, overarching federal government in which all countries can abide to and the rest of it, I don't think that is a realistic assessment of the continent or where the continent is going in the next 10 years. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Just to piggyback on that and I know we have to turn to Archie as well. You know, speaking of African supra governance, I'd love to hear some of your assessments of the African Union. And, you know, is it gaining strength? Is it becoming more relevant? What are the challenges there? So maybe we'll go to Archie and then maybe come back. We also have a comment from Clarissa Myrick Harris, but we've talked about global multilateralism, but the African Union is also, I'd love to hear a bit about your thoughts on that. Archie.
Hi, Judy, can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Awesome. There's some construction in my building, so please pardon the background noise. So I would like to just start off from where Mr. Singh left off, looking at the question of African Union and the United States of Africa and all of that stuff. I think that the continent might not be going that direction in the next 10 years, as Dr. Singh said, but I also believe that the African Continental Free Trade Area and the Agenda 2063 is actually going in some sort of that direction, even if it's not a physical one. Economically, we are looking at an integrated continent. And we are seeing this desire shape African relations, whether with China, at the BRICS, with Russia, and with the rest of the world. The report that was recently released by the African Union, ODA, NEPAD, and ISS tends to suggest that the Africa is more inclined now towards China and Russia than the US, considering the fact that the narrative that has been drafted around Africa-China, Russia-China relations is one of our partners. The narrative of win-win is there. And again, the paternalistic relationship that I talked about with the West also is still at the back of African leaders and Africans. And so a recent survey that the Afro-Sino Center did on China's response to COVID-19 pandemic in Africa compared to Western countries, our respondents said that they found China's response to be much more superior to that of the West because China was out there more readily available to give vaccines to African countries than the West were. And so we are seeing that idea of a partnership that respects African views, partnerships that sort of allows Africa to play on the stage as partners, taking more traction than one that sees Africa as a problem or as one that needs problems to be solved for. And so, for example, we now have the AFTA, which establishes and creates the largest free trade area in the world, connecting over 1.3 billion people across the continent. And even more so if we add the diaspora. Also, we know that if AFTA is well implemented, according to the World Bank and the ISS, that it would lift about 30 million Africans out of extreme poverty. We also know that AFTA is actually demonstrating to the world that Africa could be an emerging leader. And this point has been re-echoed by Caroline Freud, who is the Global Director of Trade, Investment, and Competitiveness, right? So even though Africa may not, as it stands now, be looking at a united Africa where it comes under one government or anything, but the steps that the African Union is taking together is with its agencies, is moving in a direction of integrating Africa economically, and also, the movement of people within Africa is one of the biggest challenges. And I think that it should be something that Africa should pay more attention to, because when that happens, in my initial submission, I hinted that if there's people-to-people engagement and we are strategic about it, especially with now most countries allowing for 90-day free visas for African passport holders, this is going to allow for Africans to travel within the continent more. This is going to allow for Africans to appreciate their diversity and also leverage on their uniqueness and what makes them united. And my last point on this is that one of the reasons why Africa is particularly interested in China, and more so the African Union is interested in China, is that China is one of the few partners who have supported inter-African infrastructure development. The African Union has over the years struggled to make a case for infrastructure, for funding of inter-African infrastructure, right? Which is essential to connecting Africa. Now, we know that it is more difficult to travel within Africa than to travel outside of Africa. We know that it is more difficult to move goods and services within Africa than it is to move goods and services between Africa and other continents, right? And so if we really are interested in seeing this united and prosperous Africa, then the idea of having African partners supporting its continental agenda of infrastructure like the Tazara Railway, it's essential. And China seems to be interested in doing that. And I think the rest of the world must start thinking about, African engagements in ways that support the African agenda, which is stipulated in the Agenda 2063. And when that is done, we are going to see a more favorable response from Africa. And Africa can also be in a position to contribute invaluably to the rest of the world if allowed to function and to play as a partner. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I actually think you see the US kind of responding to that aspiration. There's the first regional Millennium Challenge Corporation grant to build a transportation between Niger and Benin. There's the investments into the Lobito corridor, connecting Angola, DRC, Zambia, Tanzania. There's also by the United States this investment in building processing capacity in some of the mineral rich countries to kind of equalize kind of the global playing field on processing of minerals. So I would say, and on the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, I mean, I think speaking to the point about African integration, it's a wonderful aspiration, and if done well, as you say, it's if implemented effectively, but you can also see potential pitfalls in any integration scheme. There's going to be winners, there's going to be losers, kind of unions may have a say. Migration, much as it's all the free market, free movement of people and goods, but we've seen over the decades expulsions from Nigeria, xenophobic reactions in South Africa, Angola expelling Congolese, and so forth. So it's going to have some political issues it's going to have to deal with it as well on that. We have a comment from Clarissa Myrick Harris. Dr. Myrick Harris from Morehouse. Would you like to make your point? Then we'll turn to any additional questions here we have.
Good morning, all. It's good to be with you. I thank you for the invitation to participate in this series of forums. It's very much needed at this point in time. I want to, in part, kind of follow up on what on some of the things that Bob Wekesa in particular, and also perhaps Priyal Singh have touched on around ways to integrate, ways to unite Africa. The economic realm and the education realm, I think, have a great deal of potential. I recently have been interfacing with two nonprofit organizations established by a broad cross-section of people on the continent and in the diaspora in the US and the UK and so on, and Caribbean. One organization is the African Diaspora Development Institution, ADDI. I don't know if any of you know of that, but it is a robust, heroic effort of a group of individuals led by a woman named Dr. Arikana Chiombre Quo, who are originally of Zimbabwe. She's resided in the States for a number of years as a medical doctor. But she has united people across sectors: education, business, social organizations. And it's a robust group that has as its main goal to forge partnerships among people on the continent, various countries, and in the United States, and I said other parts of the diaspora, to establish economic development projects, trade, agriculture. It's very ambitious. There's the ambition of actually creating a city and I think a site has been identified in Ghana, nicknamed Wakanda. And it sounds like a really, to some, perhaps a vision, a dream that might not be able to be realized because of the current state of affairs on the continent of Africa. But if you have individuals with this kind of dedication, mission to really focus on the interest of the continent, as opposed to the interest of Western countries, the United States, other countries of the global north, or Russia or China, then I think it's something that can take place. We have to understand that in terms of the relationships between the countries of Africa and the US and other Western countries, it's the global, the colonialism, enslavement. These are surely historical facts, but there's exploitation going on right now. It's not just about the memory of people who suffered when they were persecuted and prosecuted in the days of apartheid, but it is about what's happening now in terms of the exploitation of the continent by corporations, the US and Europe, who extract the wealth of the countries and yet the people in those countries remain impoverished. So what are the ways, and this is a roundabout way of asking the question, what are the ways that this group can come together to assist, support perhaps, and provide advice and resources for organizations like the ADDI. And then there's another organization, Africa's Brain Bank, actually will have its conference in September there in Los Angeles, which I will probably attend. Okay, so I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much, because we're just getting at time. I do want to take a few more comments from the group. Thank you, Doctor. We have a question comment from Johnson Ekpere online, and then we have a question here, and the gentleman got a hand. Okay, and there. Okay, so we got 4 questions. Let's go to Johnson Ekpere first.
Can you please unmute? Professor, you have to click the unmute button. Can you hear me? I think he's just reading.
Okay, Mr. Ekpere will come back to you. Be prepared to unmute. Let's go to the lady here. Can you just come to the table? Yes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tiffany. I work in the tech sector. I'm also Nigerian and have a background in IR, which led me here today. My question is, with the recent coups that have occurred, what are your thoughts on ECOWAS's response, and particularly their evolving response to this recent coup in Niger and possibly threatening force? Thank you.
Great, thank you, Tiffany. Question. Where was it? Yes, gentlemen.
Here. Right. So are we ask questions or comments?
Well, a quick comment, but
Quick question. Gotcha. So my name is, I can do that. I can do it. So my name is William. I am the chairman of Black Men Network. I'm the CEO of Black Men Network, and I'm the chairman of Intelligence Working Together. Right. And then listening to a lot of the comments and responses from the audience and from the people that were speaking, I noticed that there's a lot of similarities and between what's going on in the African continent and what's going on with the African-American people here in the United States, right? They were talking about the freedom of expression and the way it quickly gets squashed.
Nobody is understanding the fact that the coup
Sorry, he was
is against France.
Before. I don't think he has been hearing it.
What happened?
okay, Professor Ekpere, can you hold for a moment? Can you hear me?
Maybe I can just read out his question. He sent the question.
Okay. Okay, but please continue, William.
Right. So I was talking about the.
Not fair.
It's supposed to be a really good question.
Sorry.
Gotta be great. Right. So the similarities between what's going on in the African continent and what's going on here with the African American community in America. Ultimately, my question is, why is it the African continent seeking assistance from the African American community in America, and why isn't the African American community seeking to work with different continents and in Africa, right? If we are facing the same challenges, and it seems like Africa has more wisdom and more, they have more energy for dealing with these situations, okay, because they've come through such things here recently. Like I was talking about the squashing of freedom of expression, right? That happens here in America. It seems like as close as Africa gets to removing colonization from the continent, the quickly it gets squashed. That's the same thing that happens here in America. It seems like the more the African American men here in America, the more they remove themselves from the slavery mindset, the quickly it seems like a form of aggression, a social aggression in America, right? So if we know that we're facing these similar challenges, especially like when it comes to like taking firm positions like Africa, people want more and more for people to, for Africa to take a firm position in the Ukrainian war, the same thing that they want the African American community to do here in America, take a firm position in democracy or in LGBTQ wars and social wars and so on and so on. Why aren't we making a gateway here for us to work with the African continent? I think that would be a great structure to have Africa, the African continent, to be able to work together. It'll also put more legitimacy on the issues that we're facing. They're the same issues, right? But if we continue to be a scattered people, especially here in America, then no one's going to take us seriously, right? And the same thing with African nation, the African continent. If you continue to be scattered countries, how do you want people to take you seriously if you seem to be scattered, right? And you want them to help you to unite? I think it's too much outsourcing or outward looking for solutions when there should be more of an inward looking for solution. And I think also that people, lastly, that people should pay respects to the fact that Africa is trying to do something and do better and not be so harsh on them, because, you know, it seems like there's more of an outside entity that's trying to, as best they can, to keep Africa as suppressed as possible, because they have more of a financial interest in the country than they do an interest in the country, continent being united.
Great, thank you, William. Great point. I mean, in both cases, both here and in Africa, governments are often part of the problem. I think the point you're making is, you know, perhaps kind of transnational activism. Kind of how do you build those connections beyond the government to government? Because it's often the government that's suppressing freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. I'm all for greater kind of transnational connection between activist groups and human rights groups on a lot of the issues you raised. So thank you, William. Where are we now? Ekperi, Mr. Ekperi, and then we had one here and there. Okay. Are we able to bring Mr. Ekperi back, or?
Oh, can you hear us?
Or do you want to read his question?
Sure. Do current Africa leaders really understand the concept of multilateralism as being discussed academically as it relates to their political, social, and economic development? There could be substantial knowledge and interpretive gaps that make application of multilateralism to the African objective reality to some needs.
Okay, great. I know we're cramming a lot because I do want to come back to a round from our speakers. The gentleman here, the lady, and so if you can make these short, and we'll go back to our speakers to kind of wrap things up.
Good morning, I'm Chief Bajon Biedika from Mokan, Bapungo. in the northern region of the Republic of Cameroon. I am so thankful with the organizers of this organization. I want to request and also see if this can be possible. What am I talking of? Sovereign powers in Africa actually belongs to traditional rulers, which I'm one of them, although at the lower bottom. Whatever they do in Africa with elected powers, if the sovereign powers, which are the traditional rulers, doesn't keep their visa, it's not going to work because they actually own the grassroots. And when they talk, the people listen to them. Just like they say, vote for this person, that's the person they're going to vote for. With this wonderful organization, can you incorporate African traditional leadership inside here? That's my first question. My second question.
Okay, we're gonna have to keep it at one.
Right, so that's the last question, which is
Very brief, okay.
yeah, is I hear we talk of trying to get the United States of Africa. Can we have it by the United Countries of Africa? Because there's much that can be achieved with that. As I heard the brother we just left, he said, because the African countries are doing a lot, being more together than everybody think, but people out of the world, they don't know. But I'm home almost every other month. So can we have the United Countries of Africa instead of United States of Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And our last question.
Yes. My name is Patricia Seki. Thank you for inviting us today. I am the president and founder of an organization, non-profit organization called Africa Farm Performance. That means African Women of Excellence. I'm originally from Cameroon. I've served like a board member of the Agua Civil Society Network for the last 4 years. And because I work with a lot of women, I've been, bringing the women here to be able to understand the Agua program and to bring the products here through the Agua program. But unfortunately, this program, they didn't, understand and bring their goods here. So last year, we came up with a program, economic program, because we wanted to, women in Africa are ready to export like any other country in the world. We don't need to have a program where we don't have to pay the custom. We want like any other country in Africa. So we opened last year an African Trade Center in Maryland, where we are showcasing products from there. So last year during the Leader Summit here, when a lot of African presidents came here, we attended a lot of those organizations, but right now we don't see the outcome really on the ground in the continent. Okay. And we see now in Russia what's going on, where they're saying that they're going to do this, they're going to do this, and they're doing it. So my question is, okay, how we can do things, but how can we do it quickly? Because last year was the Leader Summit, but we don't see things happening. If we can do it, that will be great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, I think those last three questions were kind of interesting in that they all connected to kind of getting out of the kind of the government to government multilateralism to the people to people, or the role of citaizens in all of this and citizen interests.
Jennifer, one quick question from Janelle Duncan, which may relate to this topic as well. Okay.
Oh, he had to go, so maybe I could just read out his question.
I can read his question.
Oh, sure. Yeah, he had to go.
It's U.S.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
The U.S. has declared graphite as a strategic asset. Are there any private sector opportunities for collaboration with nonprofit and post-secondary institutions to train and place Africans in high-level positions?
Okay, that's going to be difficult to answer within the constraints of this. Let's turn to our speakers kind of for thoughts on those final questions, but also the final points you'd like to kind of hit upon and have us take home. Shall we start with Archie?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Judy. And I would conclude with the question that my brother asked about, what the diaspora or the African Americans can do leveraging, the African experiences. I think that is a very good question. And I think that we can learn a lot from what happened with the Year of Return, which President Nana Akufo-Addo did, commemorating 400 years of slavery. And I think it was generally very successful. We had over 1 million Africans and African Americans and Africans in the diaspora coming to Ghana within that year. Also, we saw the country taking quick steps to sort of tweak its visa policies to allow for that Year of Return. After COVID-19, we also saw in 2022, after the return policy, which the president again instituted, which went on in 2022, and again they're expecting it to happen again in 2023. I think that is one of the things that African leaders or Africans can leverage on. I've sat in a series of meetings with nonprofits and other non-governmental organizations who are trying to take advantage of these ideas. We are now looking at the Africa trade, cultural festivals that are coming up. The Afro-Sino Center is also looking at using film festivals like FESPACO to bring or to draw African energies back into the continent. And I think that we can leverage all these brilliant initiatives, again, outside the government to government approaches. But I want to use this opportunity to say that, like my brother again recognized, that the Africans and African Union and Africans in the diaspora have come far and are doing a lot of work. Again, there's a lot of internal challenges that we have to address. And the same way, we also have to recognize that there's a lot of external pushbacks that the African community or African leaders also have to deal with. So they're dealing with the internal challenges as well as the external pressures within these multilateral organizations and even, bilateral relations between Africa and the rest of the world. And so we need to recognize this. And Africans, again, the issue of African agency has to come in here again. It's been going on, but Africans in the diaspora, which is the sixth sector, they really need to take advantage of that. The challenge, and I need to be very honest, is that we do not have systems yet to support even the return of Africans in the diaspora into the continent. I mean, if you leave, I'm an example of that. If you leave the United States or the West and you come back to Africa, it is such a struggle to even find a place and a niche, but it is not impossible. And I think that we need to be aware of the challenges on the ground and yet be very mindful and recognize the opportunities that are on the continent. And I believe that with the support of the African, which is also stipulated in the African Union Agenda 2063, with the zeal and the support of the African people, the African Union and the African continent, together with its diaspora, can achieve all of its aspirations. And I believe so strongly that we can do that. But we need to realize like I said, and I'm going to re-echo that, the challenges that we have externally and also the issues inward. And I believe that the issues we have within Africa, especially with regards to the diversity of cultures and the disunity, could literally and more importantly be harnessed as positives to transform and to shape the Africa that we want. Thank you so much, Judy and the team, for inviting me, Professor Wekesa. I think this was a brilliant session, and I'm really excited to have been part of this. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Let's turn to Priyal Singh. Among the questions, I wonder if you might take on the reaction, your reaction to ECOWAS's stance on the Niger coup as part of your final remarks. So Priyal.
Thank you. I was about to say the only question I'm actually qualified to answer is probably the question on Niger and ECOWAS. So I'll just be very brief in my comments, just to say that ECOWAS is definitely, there's no argument about it. It is the most capable regional economic community when it comes to dealing with unconstitutional changes in governments. ECOWAS has a very clear track record over the last couple of years, a successful track record in responding to unconstitutional changes in governments. And I would assume that as a bloc, as a regional economic community, they will be steadfast and quite clear in driving forward a common regional approach to Niger. Certainly, if this happened in Southern Africa or East Africa or Central Africa, I would be less confident that we would see a unified regional response to this issue. So certainly Niger is not going to be a country in good standing, certainly with their regional neighbors, certainly with the African Union, and we can expect a strong regional condemnation and continental condemnation that should be forthcoming and in support of broader international efforts to respond to the crisis in Niger currently. With that being said, I'd just like to thank you as the conference organizers. It's been a pleasure to be a part of this discussion, and I will conclude there. Thank you very much.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Priyal. And Bob.
All right, no, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, colleagues. I suppose my closing remarks or comments will, first of all, comment on the African Union and its capacity to serve as a continental governing body, which is a question that was posed. And I think that to this question, it's an interesting one because today's topic is about multilateralism. And some of the points that we raised point to the reform of the global governing structures, which do not at the present fit into Africa's interests. I think the point here then is that we Africans also understand, many African scholars understand that for that reform of the UN, for example, to happen, we also need to start with the reform of the AU, of the African Union. I think colleagues will recall that in 2016, the African Union undertook an analysis of areas of reform, the so-called Kagame initiative. It was led by President Kagame, and the point, some of the points that were raised were that Africa has many problems, so it needs to prioritize some of the key areas that we need to focus on. And I think one of the successes that has arisen out of that is the acceleration of the African Continental Free Trade Area, is the rise in the uptake of the African passport to improve, connection between, travel of Africans. So right now, in fact, for FYI, for your information, Africans travel on regional passports. I travel on the East African passport as a Kenyan, and my colleagues from ECOWAS travel on that. And I think that is one of the quick achievements that have been made. However, the African Union has many challenges. Key among them, one can go on, but the key one is financing. The African Union still relies on external funding. And so if the French or the Americans or the Chinese are actually bankrolling you or meeting your administrative budgetary costs, then you upfront, you do not have agency. So I think that finds itself, that it manifests itself in the fact that decisions are made with the donor in mind. So peace and security, for example, the Chinese are critical in that space. like peacekeeping missions. So, the African Union is very unlikely to make a major decision on matters peace and security without looking at the Chinese funding. Health, the US is quite critical in that space. The African CDC is modeled on the American CDC, for example. And therefore, matters of health, because the African Union cannot fund its own projects, it has to look over its shoulders to see what will the Americans think in the health space. Issues to do particularly with trade, because Africa trades quite a lot with the European Union. And they've been, of course, we are all familiar with European partnership agreements. The Europeans bankroll quite a number of trade and economic initiatives. So we have to look to the Europeans and see what they are saying before we do anything. So I suppose a reform of the AU will have to start with the capacity for the African Union itself to fund its own projects in a sustainable way before we can even start talking of looking at the bigger reform agendas across the continent. I think I'll close by making a comment on the diaspora issue. One is that, first of all, I think as an African scholar myself, and I know this is the case with many other colleagues, we are thoroughly confused, particularly by the US, when it comes to matters diaspora. Because on the one hand, we have solidarity with our African American colleagues, but we also have very many white Americans that are our friends as well. And so now you're approaching the US, and you have to look on the one side, the African American end of things, on the other side, the white American end of things. Then you have to consider issues of racial discrimination and so forth. So I think in this sphere, it looks like the ball is back in the American court to clean their act in terms of that whole area, because I don't think Africans can sort out that. Having said that, I suppose one of the areas, in fact, colleagues are here, Jennifer, Adam, I think Krista Johnson from Howard is not quite there, but we've been working hard at this under the Africa-US Universities Network. We think that generating ideas, undertaking research so that we have solutions that are evidence-based is absolutely critical. But one of the areas that one doesn't even need to do a lot of research is to consider the fact that the African diaspora in the US, be it the recent, what we call new diaspora or the old diaspora, is one of the highly educated in the world. That's a major resource. We have the African diaspora in the US is also one of the wealthiest. That's a major resource as well. I mean, anywhere in the world as well. So I suppose in looking at some of these solutions, we have to understand the asset that is the African diaspora from the point of view of being the most knowledgeable. We have historically Black colleges and universities that are very well positioned. They could partner with their counterparts of the continent. We have the African Studies Centers, including Jennifer's Institute of African Studies at GW. These are important avenues for engagement. But lastly, we might want to connect this to the idea that the African Union in 2012 designated diaspora as the 6th region of the continent. So we have the 5 regions of the continent geographically, but the diaspora is the 6th one. I don't think it has worked very well as the 6th region. For example, diaspora is not invited to AU meetings and so forth. You don't see it incorporated into forward-looking programs. I suppose looking for solutions at that point will be a most helpful thing to do. And thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to leave the last word to Adam, but just my thanks to the speakers and to the great questions within the room. Adam, the floor is yours to wrap up.
And my thanks as well to all the speakers in Africa, all the questions, to our moderator, Jennifer Cooke, and to all of you for coming from embassies, from educational institutions, from all around the area, and of course, from all around Africa and the United States, including, I did see a musician who I did not expect to join at 6 a.m. his time, but he joined and stayed with us. So thanks to everyone. Our next program on this series, August 28th, Climate Change, Ambassador Ray will be one of the speakers. And we hope you'll join us then, and feel free to spread the word. So thanks for everyone.